So welcome to the housing session through lunch. You can hear lots of munching in the room. We are going to be talking about the provision of affordable housing, homelessness throughout OECD countries. So my name is Keelan Barr and I'm the editor of the data projects team at The Guardian in London. And today, myself and the 6 panelists over the course of the next 90 minutes are going to be talking about some of the kind of key issues that we've covered in our work and work with in terms of through the OECD, through public sector, and also in an academic setting. So let me just give you a little bit of background also. We have a live feed with questions that you can pose to us through the BCast system. So if you log on your phone, you can post questions which we'll respond to later on in the session. We also have a poll, which we'll get to at the latter half of the session. So I'm going to ask them actually just to put the poll up now. So there should be a question which you can respond to if you look at the pamphlet that you have on your chair. So to begin with, across OECD countries, 1 in 8 people lack access to regular access to housing. And this is at a time when homelessness is increasing and children make up a growing part of that population of the homeless. And when we talk about homelessness in family situations, we're talking about homelessness which also affects people's health, their employment prospects, and also their access to housing. So it becomes a cycle. And we're talking about an increasing number of children within that realm as well. When we go on to consider the housing market, within OECD countries, on average, about 15% of renters pay more than 40% of their income as rent. And when we talk about that in the UK in particular, where I work, where I'm based, in the UK, renting is becoming a growing norm, particularly for millennials. But what about it? When we look at policy, it also seems that it's not cutting through. In the UK, there is no statutory definition of affordable housing, which really starts to raise the question, if we haven't defined what the problem is, how do we even begin to develop the tools to address it? So, rental costs are not just an economic issue, and I think that's something when we debate it, particularly in forums like this, sometimes we can forget or sometimes we can overlook. They're also a societal and a family issue, because if you can't move out of home as a millennial, or if you can't move out of the rental market, you also have some difficulties in terms of growing up, in terms of these typical markers of adulthood. And I don't think there has been a very broad discussion, really, about what impact this may have on people's mental well-being as the generation which we call millennials matures. And also when we talk about family structures, it places a lot of a burden on the older generation within family structures also. Omar has done a lot of work. We'll get to talking about also the burden that this places in cities and communities and the development of local groups and communities in terms of rent. What's the long-term benefit or the long-term burden in talking about social and urban planning when we talk about rent? So in the UK, as in many countries, the private rental sector is overtaking that of the government in terms of the provision of affordable housing also. And when we talk about who does that affect, we're really looking at low-income groups. Low-income groups are the most affected. They also put up with the most in terms of poor quality housing because there are no other options. So when we talk about retirement, moving on from the people who are most affected by it, a lot of our retirement planning also talks about an expectation of retirement with the assumption of home ownership built into that, which is a massive assumption, particularly where home ownership may no longer be the norm. And if home ownership is no longer the norm, but in fact becomes an anomaly, it raises questions as to if we need to radically rethink how we plan for retirement and how we advise people to plan for retirement too. So these are just some of the questions that myself and the panel will be discussing over the course of the next 90 minutes. It would be great if we could bring the poll up on the screen. We're going to ask the audience as well to chip in because we want to hear about your views and what you think. And the question that we're asking today is, should access to good quality, affordable housing be seen as a human right? We'll revisit the results of the poll later on. But let's just bear in mind as well that we asked this question in the context of some countries, some OECD countries, pushing for access to housing as a right in terms of the definition of assessing someone's right to housing or someone's access to housing. But then what about the provision itself rather than just assessing somebody's need? And also there are within the Sustainable Development Goals, in 2030 a number of countries have signed up through the UN to deliver affordable housing to their citizens. But without clear policies, it remains unclear as to how that will be achieved. So we'll come back to the results of the poll with the panel later on. But let me go through my fabulous list of panelists, and I'll introduce them, and then we will also introduce ourselves, and we'll start Q&A. After we have a Q&A session, then we'll turn the questions open to the audience, and we'll take questions through the BCAS system. Okay. So immediately to my left is Willem Adema. He's Senior Economist at the Social Policy Division, Employment, Labour and Social Affairs at the OECD. Beside Willem is Omar Al-Rawi, Member of Parliament and Member of the City Council of Vienna in Austria. We have Matthew Desmond, who is a Professor of Sociology at Princeton University and the author of Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize last year. Sitting next to Matthew, we have Shamubil Eakaub, who is the author of Generation Rent, which is an overview of the rental situation in New Zealand. And then we have Vanessa Engel, who is the head of Banque l'Équipement and Emao Defi in France. And you're going to answer some of your questions in French. So if anybody has any issues with translation, there are headsets that you can pick up. And then we also have Freek Spinnevin, who's the director of Fintesa. Fintesa are a group of homeless charities across Europe, and they're doing very, very interesting work. So I will hand it over to my group of panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll get to questions.
Thank you. Hello there. Bon appetit. And I must say, I have seen many panels in this room before, and it's never been as packed as I see it today. That shows that there is considerable interest in housing issues and homelessness issues, I hope, and maybe we can use that to the good. Couple of things. I work in the Social Policy Division of the OECD, doing work on gender pay gaps, gender equality, social statistics, but also I'm responsible for the Affordable Housing Database, which we put out for the first time early last year. And we want to update that database and enrich that with policy work. So I'm very much looking forward to your contributions and ideas as to where we should be looking for work. OECD, we have data. It's actually, housing is one of the more difficult areas to work in terms of collecting data and getting concepts right. Kaylin already said it, there is no acceptable definition of affordable housing. There is no acceptable definition, commonly accepted, I should say, definition of homelessness. So there's a lot of work to do in this area. Just to give you a little bit of a scene setting thing, if you look at the households across the OECD, about more than 60% live in their own home. About 25% live in the private rental sector, and just over 6-7% live in a social rental sector. So a lot of people actually live in their own home. Now, as you will know, Prior to the Great Recession, real house prices increased very rapidly, more than 25% over the 10 preceding years. Then they fell again up till 2013, 14, about 10, 15%, but they've picked up. So we're across the OECD, we're back at that level around 27, 28. And the trends in countries are very, very different. Some countries have not faced very sharp price-to-income increases. Other countries have, and with that have seen a growing issue of housing affordability. One way of defining it is looking at the people who looking at the households who spend more than 40% of their income on housing of their budget. And across the OECD, that is about 10% for both tenants and owners. But if you look at the low-income group of people, i.e. those who have incomes less than 50% of the median, that is almost 40%. So particularly low-income groups face huge challenges in terms of housing affordability. There are quality issues. Lots of the housing in poorer OECD countries leave a lot to be desired in terms of quality. There are issues with having individual access to your own toilet. 60% in Mexico does not have that. In Lithuania and Latvia, that is 30%. So these are important shortcomings as well. And then, of course, the extreme form of housing exclusion is homelessness. As I said, there's no commonly accepted definition of homelessness. FEANSA, the organization led by Mr. Spinnewijn, has been trying very hard to get a European definition at least. But you see, therefore, also a wide discrepancy in the numbers. New Zealand, 1% of the population is considered homeless. 1%. But that includes people who live on the street, people who live in sheltered accommodation, people who live in temporary accommodation where they normally do not live, or live with family. In short, a very broad definition of homelessness. The US, with a much narrower definition of homelessness, i.e. those who live rough or in sheltered accommodation, has 0.2, 0.3% of the population as homeless. But it still concerns more than 500,000 people. And while homelessness has declined in the US since 2010, it went up this year, or from 2016 to 2017 for the first time. And while the homelessness in the US also increasingly concerns families with children, they have managed to at least get them in sheltered accommodation rather than being a substantial part of the unsheltered living rough component of homelessness. In many European countries, homelessness is increasing. In the Netherlands, where it's going well economically. In Germany, the increase in homelessness is enormous, driven by a decline in affordable and social housing, but also by an influx of migrants and refugees. So the upward trend in homelessness, I would say, is one of the most worrying trends in terms of affordability across the OECD. Let's leave it at that.
Thank you, and those are all issues that we will pick up on and discuss in further detail. Omar.
So as I understood, it's not only introduction, but also to go inside the issue. Okay. So my name is Omar Rawi. I'm elected member of the City Council and the Regional Parliament in Vienna, now in my fourth term. I'm educated civil engineer, master degree, so I work also in a construction company, and I'm a member of the Committee for Urban Planning and Renewable Energy, and also substitute member of the Social Housing Commission. When we talk about Vienna, and there is something unique that is in Vienna, maybe that's the reason why I've been invited here and to to introduce this system is that we had actually a very, very bad history. When you go 1 century back, the end of the First World War, Vienna climbed its population from 400,000 within 20 years to 2 million. It was one of the worst places in the world to live. The tuberculosis illness at that time was called the Viennese illness. 10 persons were living on approximately 30 square meters. There was no, 90% of the house units didn't have water or water closet. And then when the democratization started, there was a big effort of the city of Vienna to start a social housing program. And the social housing program ended. It started with a taxal reform where there was a tax taken by everybody who works, from the employee and from the companies that employs the people, and it was used only for this construction. So we started with a social housing program that ended at the end that the city of Vienna now owns itself about 250,000 of the house units. There's 1 million house units, so that's mean percentage. I've wrote it here about 14% of all Viennese lives in a household that belongs to the community. The second unique thing we have in Vienna, we have a lot of so-called non-profit construction developers, about 13. They develop a lot of householdings that have very strong measures that is subsidized by the city of Vienna. And with these developers and the own units that belongs to the city, I tell you now a figure, you will be very astonished, 61% of all Viennese lives either a subsidized house unit or in a unit that belongs to the city of Vienna. When you are such a global factor on the market, then you reduce also the rental increases in the private sector because they have to compete with such a global player on the market. The third thing that is unique in this so-called social housing programs, it's a social housing on a very, very high level. So you would find also, not always, but also so-called affordable or subsidized house companies where you will have a swimming pool on the roof and maybe a sauna in the basement, and it's made by star architects like Zaha Hadid or Dominique Perrault. Or, so it's not just saying if these people live in a so-called subsidized or social housing that it should be in a very bad standard. The other way, we have all these projects has to be a low energy or passive house standards with a lot of very important implementation of very high rules of the environmental sector. One of the unique things that there is that we have a very, very high level access to this householding. So we don't want only the poorest who can't afford to live there. We want to have also the middle class living there. So just give you a figure of you're married, a couple, and you have 2 children. It's allowed to have 80,000 euros income a year, net on net basis, not after the taxes, and still you can have this access. And once you are inside, you can stay forever there. So nobody's telling you now you're earning too much, going away. That's why we have reached that there is a social cohesion. So you might see in all these house construction buildings, there is someone who's an academic, the other one may be jobless, the other one is educated, the other one is maybe a taxi driver. And that gives a lot of balance in this project. So you don't find devastations, you don't find sort of ghettoization. And this is the thing that we're very proud in Vienna. If you see the business card of any person and you read his address, that doesn't give you any indication to make a categorization of this person. If you see the way the district he's living, it doesn't say that he's not educated or he's poor or he's rich. It could be both, yeah? So you have, of course, we have places where it's more expensive than other, but even in the 19th district in Vienna, where the richest people lives, we have one of the biggest social housing project that's called the Karl Marx Hof. So one of those who a lot of people goes there, and even if you see then the result of elections, and this very conservative big district in the polls on the national elections. The Social Democrats wins there. So there is no indication where do you belong there. And the thing that we managed also, that we never thought of privatization these things. One of the big mistakes that happened, for example, in cities nearby Vienna, like Bratislava, like the former communist countries, once they become a democracy, they sold all these flats to their inhabitants without having a frame of law who is going to invest in the quality of the building, how is it ruled, the facade, the stairs of the house, and they have an enormous problem, and once you sell it, then they're out of the market. You never can use it again. And we saw that, very interesting, the statistic in the last 5 years, the income in Austria increased only by 4%, but the increase of rentals in the private sector was about 25%, and where the city of Vienna is the owner, it was only 11%, and in this so-called non-profit organization, construction companies, it was about 12.5%. So you see that when the government, or there's a big measurement how to deal and control this sector, then you have really a possibility as a city, as a community, to make a surface, a ceiling for this increase. And once you leave it to the free market, it's very impossible to have the control. And maybe this is one of the things that in Vienna we're very proud that we have it, and a lot of people. Just one statistics also very interesting, that the city of Vienna spends on the subsidies of house for the living units. I think I don't know the figure anymore, but I think maybe 10 times than than Germany spends on all its places. So there's a lot of delegations always coming and seeing how is this happening, and I think that could be a model to see. Asking the question if that's
something that we'll pick up on as well as we go.
Yeah.
This idea of this question around have governments relinquished too much control when it comes to the provision of affordable housing for the rental market in particular. So, and the work that is happening in Vienna is really it's a bit of a model really for what we're not seeing in other parts, particularly in the UK. Matt Desmond.
Hi. I'm from America. Sorry. So I'm an academic, and I'm also a writer for the New York Times Magazine. We've heard a lot of statistics. Let me tell you a story. So I was in Trenton, New Jersey the other day, spending time with a woman named Vanessa. She's a home health aide. So she helps folks that are aging in their home, helps them take a shower, take their medicine, take them shopping. She has 3 children. She's been homeless for 2 years. She can't find housing in the private market of a very soft market city that doesn't take almost everything she has of her income. Now, America looks at the statistics coming out of the OECD countries and sees a global housing crisis all around the world. I think the world is facing 2 giant problems. 1, incoming climate change, and 2, making our cities livable again. But when we look at your statistics, we find them quite quaint, right? I mean, we have a giant affordable housing crisis in the United States. Cost of median asking rent has increased by over 70% in real dollars since 1995. The cost of fuels and utilities has risen by 52% in the 2000s alone. Couple that with stagnant incomes and a failure of the United States federal government to bridge the gap, and you have a housing crisis of incredible proportion. Most of our poor renting American families spend at least 50% of their income on housing costs today. 1 in 4 of those families spend over 70% of their income just on rent and utilities. Now, this is a smart room, so I know y'all are like, I don't believe those numbers. Let me tell you what. When I first crunched those numbers, I didn't believe them. They come from the census. Let me tell you who they exclude. They exclude everyone that is spending over all of their income on housing costs. Now, if you guys know these data, you know that there are a lot of folks in the census reporting that. Some of that is reporting error, but some of that is just life. Like, I've met people that are spending 80%, 90% of their income just on a rent. Forget about utilities. How is that even possible? Well, what you do is you pay your landlord in the winter when there's a moratorium on energy shutoffs or gas shutoffs, and you short the electricity company. But then you switch teams in the spring when that moratorium lifts, and you start trying to pay off your debt to get back in the black so you can benefit from that moratorium come next winter. That's why evictions spike in the summer and drop in the winter. The numbers that I just quoted to you are scary and high and unbelievable and absolutely conservative. So we've reached a point where evictions have become incredibly commonplace in America. By my lab's calculation, 2.3 million Americans were evicted last year. How do we put that number in context? That's twice the number of people that we arrest for drugs every year in America. That's 36 times the number of overdoses we see every day in America. 2.3 million people, and that's an underestimate because it doesn't count formal evictions in states that we don't have data for, like California, and it doesn't count informal evictions that never go through the inside of a courtroom. Evictions is tearing up communities, it's destroying lives, and it's contributing to poverty. And so I'd like to continue that conversation. I'm going to be brief so we can kind of have like a dialogue, a Q&A. So, sound good?
Great, thank you. Shamuil.
Right, so I'm from New Zealand, and it's, I think, midnight in New Zealand right now, so my body clock is really messing with me. 3 years ago, I wrote a book with my wife called Generation Rent, and the reason why we came up with that name was because in the 2013 census, over 51% of adults in New Zealand were renting. 51%. So over half of adults in New Zealand are now renting. So New Zealand has a very long history and tradition of homeownership being a very important part of what it is to be a New Zealander, whether it's in terms of having security of tenure, whether it's to have that social inclusion, or whether it's to retire comfortably. So there are so many things that are built up in homeownership in New Zealand. But what has happened over the course of the last 3 decades is that that dream has faded, and that promise of security, that promise of connection into society and community, that has faded. And we had a whole bunch of policies in the post-war era, like many other countries, where we became very focused on building up the social side of New Zealand. And part of it was to give people access to housing and give people access to home ownership. And it worked. The home ownership rate in New Zealand rose from the 1950s until a peak in 91 and has been falling since then. At the last census, it was the lowest level since 1956. The impact of that unaffordable housing, house prices rising faster than incomes, has been felt most acutely by those who are renting and those who are at the bottom. So for those who are renting, it's become much harder to save for a deposit, to have luxuries in their lives, to have comfort in their lives. And it has made it harder for people from the provinces to move into the big cities because the cost of living has become so prohibitively expensive. And when we look at what's happened to social housing and state housing, in New Zealand, most of the social housing is provided by the state. So the state housing in New Zealand is about 70,000 units, and that's for a population of 4.5 million people. The number of state houses in New Zealand has not increased since 1991, and the population has increased by over 50%. So the pressure on poor people has been extraordinary. At the last count, we had 8,000 households waiting for a state house when you have a stock of 70,000 houses. So we've got this extraordinary amount of demand. And the failures that I see is very much one of a lack of will. It's not that we don't know what to do, whether it's about rental policies or whether it's urban policies, funding of local governments, infrastructure, public transport, all of this stuff. We could have these arguments over and over again, but the solutions are actually very well known. What is missing is a lack of leadership and a lack of willingness by the political classes to actually commit to making that change. And we're going to talk about this poll that you're doing, but the reality is, I think, in New Zealand, people do not believe that everyone has a right to shelter. Because the way we have acted is we have excluded people deliberately over the course of the last 30 years. We have underbuilt in New Zealand for 40 years. The level of house building has been so low that by my count, we've probably underbuilt by 500,000 houses in the course of the last 40 years. So this is a case of extreme abdication of our duties, where it was very much a story about everybody stepping back, hoping that there was going to be some sort of miraculous solution from markets. The thing is, there is no solution for markets for poor people. There is no solution for marginalized people. And there is no solution for people who are voiceless. So when we think about the solutions, I think ultimately we can talk about all the detail, but the thing that's missing is the willingness of the public to ask for action and the ability and leadership of the political classes to do something about it.
Thank you very much. Vanessa Engel.
Bonjour, donc je m'appelle Good afternoon. My name is Vanessa Engel, and I will be speaking French. I work for an organization which is based in Paris called Emmaüs Défi. It is part of the Emmaüs movement founded by the Abbé Pierre. It was born 10 years ago in response to the Canal Saint-Martin crisis. If some of you were living in Paris back then, you may remember that there was a strong mobilization, and it led to the DALO law, right to housing law. Now, our target is homeless people and people in, well, excluded people. And our mission is to help those people stop being pavement dwellers by using as a main driver work. Thanks to work, labor, we're going to give them a global support, comprehensive support, which is going to help them get back to society. So, well, you may be wondering what I'm doing here. Well, we've come to realize that the problems faced by our workers are so numerous, so complicated, that we cannot only work on labor for those people. Housing, of course, is a major obstacle when they try to get back to the labor market, and all these problems are actually connected. So this has led us to develop for 5 years 2 assistance mechanisms related to housing. And I'm going to tell you about these projects. So my story is going to be about a story of somebody who works on the ground, so I won't give you so many figures, but what I can tell you is that homeless people waiting for a dwelling is extremely intense, extremely strong. The absence of a house poses a number of problems to them. I think we can talk about this in further depths, but as the other panelists said, housing provision is insufficient, it is not adapted, and the situation is in a stalemate. France is still trying to respond to the situation through shelters, accommodation centers, so it's very difficult to find an actual solution, a long-term solution, and this creates anxiety and difficult living conditions for those people. So, well, this is something that I will get back to.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Freek Spinnewijn. Thank you for pronouncing my name correctly. Well practiced. The organization I work for is FEANSA, and it's a European NGO that works on the issue of homelessness and extreme housing exclusion, and our members are mostly providers of shelter and hostel accommodation for homeless people, but increasingly also housing providers. Willem already said it in his introduction. Homelessness is increasing in all EU member states except Finland, and maybe we can come back to that later, why that is, because they have managed to consistently reduce the number of homeless people in the last 15 years. And it is increasing rapidly in a whole range of countries. And when I say rapidly, it's like double-digit increases in a number of years. In a couple of years is not exceptional in Europe. And it's right what Willem said, that in the US, we have seen in the last couple of years, recently it changed, quite a consistent reduction of the number of homeless people. We're always very proud in Europe about our social welfare system, but apparently we didn't manage to follow that example, because we see an increase since a number of years. And I think what is quite striking about it is that the link, I don't have to convince you that housing markets are dysfunctional in most countries at the moment. But what we find striking about the increase in homelessness is that it has the link with the dysfunctional housing market has never been more obvious than now, both as a cause of homelessness, eviction, for instance, but also as an obstacle to a solution, because people cannot leave the shelter system because there is nothing available for them. And for instance, fast increases in family homelessness is a typical indication of that, because that's usually more related or more directly related to dysfunctional housing markets than other more traditional forms of homelessness. And I think it's also important to say, if you go beyond homelessness, that housing exclusion in all its dimensions, overcrowding, quality of housing and affordability, is really a massive issue for poor people. It's like you cite the numbers in the US, I think you can find countries in Europe where you have similar frightening figures. And it's true that trends are very country specific, but one of the trends that we have seen is that East and West are converging in Europe. That's interesting, because when I started working for FEANZA 20 years ago, the housing market in East and the housing market in West were two totally separate realities. I think it's coming closer. We see similar problems. But what is common to all countries is that the divide between the poor and the non-poor in relation to housing outcomes is growing. And that should be really an issue of concern. And to keep it short and to provoke maybe some of the debate for later on, I have difficulties to link the size and the urgency of the problem in any obvious way to the welfare regime or to the stock of social housing. And if social housing is the most important housing intervention for those at the bottom end of the market, it's quite striking that you cannot make that link. I cannot say that a country like the Netherlands, for instance, that has a very big social housing stock, has less homeless people than other countries with a much smaller social housing stock. And that has, of course, to do with the way social housing functions. And connected to that, I admire what happens in Vienna, but even in Vienna, homelessness is increasing. It's still something like, if you basically control more than half of the housing stock, how is that possible? That's maybe a question I can turn back to you. Maybe also on Vienna, Omar said it's unique what's happening there in Europe. Yes, I can confirm it's absolutely unique. And I think we have to be careful not to put things that are unique as a model for the rest, because it can lead to some wasting of time for people that have no time to waste. They're in an urgent situation and they need housing now. So that's just a start.
Great. Well, that leads very well into my first question, actually. So we've kind of discussed about the requirement of housing. There's a universal need for housing, right? That's undeniable. But how can the universal need for housing be met when there's a scarcity of affordable housing, be that affordable rent or affordable when we talk about purchase, or even housing at all if you can't afford to rent at the market rate, which we currently have? And put that in the context as well of increasing inequality, where we do have double-digit growth of homelessness and rising numbers of evictions. How can we ensure that there is effective provision of housing to meet this universal need in that context? I'll put the question to Frika, actually.
I was expecting a second, but okay, it's fair to make me answer first. I think it's an impossible question to answer. I think the time dimension is important. We have to take time and over time be consistent in what we want to achieve. I think the Viennese example shows that. I said you started after the Second World War and you probably continued on the same path for a few decades, and that helps, of course. But depending on the housing problem you speak of, the time dimension is, of course, different. Some people can wait a little bit longer than other people. And that leads to some issues that we should address and that are currently quite taboo, and I'm aware that they're taboo, and I'm aware that they're complex issues. But for instance, the whole issue of allocation of social housing, I think it's something that we have to discuss. There is very few countries in Europe where the allocation is primarily organized on the urgency of the need, of the housing need. In some countries, the time on a waiting list is more important than the housing need. I can understand the logic for that, but we also have to be aware of the consequences of that. If in some countries the real social housing market is in terrible private rent, that's a consequence of that to some extent. So I think that's an area that we have to look at. That's one taboo area. The other thing that I find helpful or not helpful, depending how you look at it, to address now I lost my way of thinking, but to address the problem is to look a little bit beyond the traditional interventions that we all know of, like social housing and housing allowance systems. I'm not saying that they're not important, they're absolutely crucial. My organization would be the first organization to plead for more social housing and for the European Union to not interfere with that. Like, I don't think that there can be too much social housing, to say that. But if there is little social housing or there is no money for housing allowances, we have to be creative. And I find that in the area of provision of affordable housing solutions, we are probably a little bit too little creative. There is a lot of vacancy, for instance, in the private rent, but there is vacant buildings owned by governments. There is vacant buildings owned by the church. There is vacant office space. Many, many cities have enormous vacant office space. We should think, I'm not saying it's easy, but we should think of ways of how can we access that, even if it's only for a short time, these vacant places. I was just reading that in Paris, for instance, they observed that because the city center of Paris becomes, like in many cities, becomes less and less car friendly. So there is less and less cars that arrive into the city center. But there's quite a lot of parkings still in the city centers. Can we think of a way to convert that into housing, for instance? Again, I know it's difficult, I know it's not easy, but we should be a bit more creative, innovative. And that creativity can fill some of the gaps. It will never replace the importance of social housing or the importance of housing allowance system, but it can fill the gaps. And for people that are in very urgent need, it's not a massive amount of people. These filling the gaps can actually make the difference. So I have a relatively pragmatic approach to your question. In the longer run, I would definitely call for more social housing and more investment in social housing and more smarter investment in social housing and changing the rules, the accountancy rules and the economic rules that allows for more investment in social housing. That's the longer run. But in the shorter run, we can be a bit more innovative.
Greater creativity. And in the UK, I think a lot of people would argue, and in New Zealand as well, that they should build more houses. Maybe part of the solution is simple also, right? To create more housing stock. I'll put that question to Matt as well, this idea of a universal need for housing. How do we address it?
I think one thing we need to do is change the narrative about housing, which means we have to start telling stories about the human wreckage that the affordable housing crisis is causing. I think those of us that are in this space a lot, we're very comfortable with numbers, we're very comfortable with policy, we're not great storytellers. And I think we need to reach toward that and start forming partnerships with people that are better storytellers than we are. At least in America, we've seen the greatest moves forward when the faces of communities and people most affected by a social issue have been front and center. This is especially true with mass incarceration. We've seen a movement in the last 10 years from a place where no major politician could get elected if they weren't tough on crime, to a place where we're having a completely new conversation. And a big part of that movement wasn't about numbers and it wasn't about new policies, it was about narrative change. So I think that needs to be a big part of the story.
Because this is ultimately a story about human beings, right? We're talking about people's lives. And very often, I couldn't agree more, working in the world of data journalism in particular, very often we can get lost in the detail of the numbers and fail to tell the human stories, which is what people sit up and take account of, right? What connects to people. So yeah, that rings true to me also. Just one thing that we've touched on at various points is the role of the government. And I wanted to put the question to the panel, particularly to Shamil to begin with. I mean, the role of the government in terms of the provision of affordable housing, have they relinquished too much control? And what should be the role, if indeed they have relinquished too much control?
Yeah, so I guess from the New Zealand context, we have relinquished control, but it's more than that. We have simply stopped doing anything. Like I said, we actually haven't increased the stock of state housing in New Zealand since 1991. So it's many decades of neglect over many different governments. I think there is a role of government, because when we see what happened when the state stepped out, is the total amount of houses we were building in New Zealand fell. And it was pretty much the state that was building those additional houses that were affordable, that were relatively small, in places that were cheaper. Once the state stepped out, those kinds of houses stopped being created. So there is this quantum, or there's this continuum of housing, and there is one end of it, the affordable end, that simply isn't provided if you leave it to the market. And I think if I look at what's happening in New Zealand, there is no shortage of houses for rich people, right? You know, they can afford it. But there is a big shortage of houses that are affordable. And what we're doing is we're building 4 or 5 bedroom houses, but we're not building 1 and 2 bedroom houses that are primarily in need for people with single incomes, single moms, where a lot of the poverty is, where a lot of the homelessness is created. Those specific types of housing, which is cheaper, but in short supply, means that there is this big gap. So I see a market failure, and that market failure is not going to be met by the private sector. The only way we can deal with it is for the government to either regulate or to intervene by actually procuring that stuff. I don't think there is any other option.
And that leads perfectly to the kind of work that's happening in Vienna. Omar, what's your sense on the role of government in intervening in the market or having more responsibility when it comes to addressing issues around the provision?
Well, yes, thank you, but I just want to give a short answer to Mr. Frake. When you mentioned in the terms of house, how do you call it, the homelessness, yes, that's true, because even in the community of Vienna, at the end of the problem, if someone doesn't pay his rent, you have to deal at the end, and even people are then getting out of this housing. There's 2 things, either because of divorceness, and then one of the parts stays in there, or sometimes to ruthlessness when they're dealing with problems with the neighbors, or even not paying. But we have a very strong regulation in the law of Austria, so it's a very long term till you become homeless. And then we have implemented in Vienna a so-called warning system. If we see that he's not paying for 3 times, then he comes, and then we ask if you want to have a smaller flat and maybe somewhat cheaper and so. But this is not a guarantee if you have a social housing that you don't have homeless. And then we dealt also, we had in Vienna one of the largest challenges the last years was the refugee crisis. So Vienna is an enlarging city. It's enlarging about 25,000 citizens a year. In 2014 we had 35,000 plus, 2015 43,000 plus. Last year it came back to 27,000. And we managed that when 1 million crossed Austria in this refugee crisis terms, it's not easy to see them. Many of them went through Vienna. And we managed in Vienna that during this crisis, not even one refugee had to spend 1 night homeless on the street. So it was an effort by the city, it was an effort by the churches, by the mosques, by the Red Cross, civic society. Many people helped together to do this. And then we had to be very fast in changing the rules and for places where you can use them for living, such as barracks, old offices that was not used, maybe schools that were not in use. So we had to deal very fast in the city council to change the rules. And when we changed the rules, then we had the possibility to have all these homeless people been inside. And the most interesting thing in all my career as a parliamentarian, it's now nearly 16 years, the right-wing party and this debate in the parliament, they made a filibuster. And we had a meeting that lasted, I think, 30 hours. So I never had it in my life that we didn't sleep. And they were just talking and talking and talking just to stop the voting for helping implementing laws for crisis reasons, not for everybody, but because not they were against it, but they were against the refugees. They thought this is the thing. But that's why let's come to the thing that as a governmental and social housing, I think that it's very important because of the discussion should be a human right or not. I think it's very important. If it's not a human right, then we should at least decide it as one of the important columns of public utilities. When we think about the communities, that water, health care, schools, public transportation, energy should be something that the community and not the free market should take part of it, not only, and not to have it liberalized, talking in terms of CETA and then maybe TTIP, where everything should be liberalized, and once it's liberalized, the community is not allowed to have it back. I think that housing and social housing, affordable housing, should be considered as one of the pillars of the public utilities. And we had a great challenge in Vienna because one of the investors in Holland, I think, tried to impose in the European Union a law that doesn't allow Vienna to have this broad access to this affordable housing, and they said only for those people who are very poor, who can't afford it, they should have it, but not leave these people with the middle management to have the access. So I think you can deal a lot. You can deal with the terms of zoning, how you make the zonings of the place. The city of Vienna has a lot of stock of building grounds, former places. You know, we had a lot of old railway stations and airport. That all we decided to become a construction area, but we managed to sell it only to those who will make subsidized and affordable housing, even with lesser price. Some of the people complained and said, "Why is Vienna selling it cheaper?" Because we said we're selling it cheaper because we want that the housing that we'll build there should be affordable. That's why we're not making business with it. For example, just to tell you a statistic, between 2016 and 2018, this is within 2 years, there was 13,000 new housing units constructed in Vienna, and 9,000 of them were affordable housing. So about 70%, roughly 70% were affordable housing. So it will not help to solve the problem of the homelessness, but it helps a lot to at least to help a lot of people that lives in Vienna, that they have affordable housing. And this is very important for us to say. We once decided we are a smart city, and the mayor of Vienna said, "What's smart city? Smart city doesn't mean that the refrigerator renews its water and its food every day automatically. Our smart attitude is it's a social city. And social city means that everybody who wants to live in Vienna should afford to live in Vienna. That's why not only the doctors, even the nurse, the taxi driver, the fire, the policeman, the vegetable employee, everybody can afford to live in Vienna. They don't have to live, I don't know, 50 or 100 kilometers outside the city and have to travel every day 2 hours with the commuter train to come and then leave the city again. It's a city, and it's very interesting to see that we're a very young and a very old city. So a lot of people, young people, lives in Vienna, about 200,000 students. Then when they become a little bit richer, they go outside, and then when they become older and they want a very good health care, then they come back to Vienna and say, so this is one of the challenges also.
I really, I think I'm off here. Thank you. I really like that idea of, because there are so many discussions around this idea of smart cities, right? But very often the social side is left out, right? So what are we really talking about when we're talking about sustainable urban development? And very often we're not bringing into account the social fabric that we're building when we're, increasing housing stock, but it's not necessarily affordable, like we just talked about as well, Shamabul. Willem, wanted to turn the question to yourself as well. So this idea of government intervention, do you think governments should have more responsibility in the provision of affordable housing? Do you think they've relinquished, given up too much control, left too much of it to the private sector?
Well, if you look at the trends in the recent past, you will see that in many countries the stock of social housing has either declined or grown very slowly. So in that sense, in terms of direct construction of public or social housing, the governments have in many countries taken a step back. And I think that the good news is that they are increasingly realizing that in the past they might have had too much of a focus on demand side measures, on stimulating home ownership, rather than making sure that there is enough affordable and social housing available. When we asked countries what their priorities were in terms of housing in 2016, half of the OECD countries cited affordable housing as their main objective. I dare to say that when we do this again, hopefully later this year, early next year, that proportion will increase. But the governments cannot do it on their own. I think it's very important that everyone realizes that there's a whole set of players here. It's governments, it's local governments who often are responsible for social housing policy or for dealing with homeless people or for providing the associated services. So you have to get that all integrated. The other thing which you have to bring in is the property developers. Because otherwise, as suggested here earlier, they will just build for that segment of the market where they can make a significant profit. And that does not happen to be the houses for the low-income people. So you have to think about that. You have to think about investors. In the Netherlands, in the US, in many other countries, there are huge investors who invest in property. Get them on board. Get them investing in a secure piece of property, which at the same time provides housing for many, many households. So, and of course, you have to bring in the NGOs and the social workers who have to provide the services for homeless people. So the main point of the story here is, the governments cannot do it on their own, but they should ensure that affordable housing is built. And I would like to make a point. There's a lot of talk about housing. My colleague from New Zealand said the housing demand is shifting. We need smaller units. What we can see is that populations are aging. We have a lot of housing stock which might be providing families with children some space, but you need smaller units also for younger people. There is a growing number of families which dissolute or dissolve, or with partners who split up. You need, there's a growing demand for smaller units. And so while housing demand fluctuates and can fluctuate very rapidly, and governments can't always predict that the crisis breaks out next week, you can predict aging populations. You can see that demographic trend coming. So in our thinking about developing housing, we should bring that in.
There's so much to talk about. I mean, we're talking about homelessness, we're talking about the provision of affordable housing, be that through ownership or rent, talking about access to markets. It's so broad, there's so much to discuss. But the one thing that I think we can all agree on is that, and we've talked about this already, is that this is a human issue, right? So this is about people's lived experience as well that we're dealing with. And so if we were to say people who are dealing or experiencing homelessness, what is it, do you think, that they would want policymakers to know about? Policymakers, people in the media, people who, because this is a group of people who don't necessarily have the mic, right? They don't have the public forum. They don't have the ability to voice the concerns and their issues and within their experience of homelessness. So I wanted to put the question to Vanessa. If we were to, if we were to be able to address politicians and governments around what people need who are in the situation of homelessness, what do you think that would be?
Peut-être pour commencer, redire l'évident. Well, first of all, I would state the obvious. I would say how homelessness is a tough experience. It's constant survival. You lose your relationship with time. You lose your relationship with your body. It's very hard to keep even basic personal hygiene. This is something that we experience on a daily level, and it's extremely hard. In shelters, well, of course, shelters do as much as they can to house people, but there are a number of constraints there because people have very different lifestyles, very different hours, and there are constraints in terms of schedule. And of course, shelters are only meant to be temporary, but they end up lasting for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. That is the case in Paris anyway. And here again, this is because there's no way to find housing, there's no offer, or the offer is not adapted to demand, which has already been stated here. There's a few tactical messages I'd like to say, just to respond to what Freek said. I'd avoid pronouncing your name just not to say anything rude. But what we observe on the ground is that the Town Hall of Paris, the City Hall, has introduced a quota system for access to housing. They have a point system for homeless people. And we can really see the positive consequences of that in terms of speeding up access to housing for homeless people. There's another avenue, which is a reflection about housing. I know that Anglo-Saxon countries are a few steps ahead of us, but in France, we're still talking about shelters mostly. There's a lot of experimentation taking place, and it would be worth looking into experiments that consist in housing people with a lot of support in the background, which is also a way of avoiding support being interrupted, because the devil's all in the detail. But you can see that sometimes if your housing request is realistic and coherent, is no easy task. Perhaps the person in question hasn't updated their housing request, they lose their place in the list and they go back to square one, so situations can be quite Kafkaesque. There's also rental mediation, whereby you can ask people who have private housing to rent to make it available to vulnerable people with a subletting service which protects their rent. And then there's family pensions as well, where you have employees who cannot find long-term housing, and so you can find a mixed solution, both individual and collective. The last thing I'd like to say, and I'll add a layer of complexity here, is that we need to have adequate, sufficient offer, but those people also need to have support. If they are not supported on a day-to-day level, it can be extremely tricky for people who've been homeless for a long time to actually settle in housing. So the first thing we've done is support known as convergence, whereby we help people in a multi-dimensional way. Because if you don't have housing, you can't get a job in the long term. If you don't have a job in the long term, you can't have housing. If you have health problems or addiction issues, this can have an impact on keeping work and keeping your housing. So all of these issues need to be dealt with at the same time. There also needs to be concerted support. There needs to be coordination with all of the people that the former homeless people will be in contact with, to be more efficient, not to be redundant in the work that you do. So it's important that we talk to the various contact people. Currently, we have about 200 employees who are being monitored in this program. And what tends to work well is to carry on with the support program, because transition stages tend to be very delicate. Once the person has had access to the housing, you absolutely mustn't let them go. You need to carry on supporting them for several months to make sure that the transition stage goes on smoothly and to make sure they don't become homeless again 6 months down the line. The second type of support we've set up is through the equipment bank, where we equip the housing. So you have people who've been in shelters for years and years. It can be entire families who are lodged in hotel rooms with the family in one, the parents in one room, the children in another, nowhere to cook, nowhere to have your dinner. And so they end up in those flats and they're very happy, but they have no furniture whatsoever, no amenities. So this is set up in coordination with the private sector and the public sector. There are people from the Paris Town Hall who support those people, and the furniture and appliances are new. They are donated by businesses on the model of food banks. So the idea is to say that in order to furnish your house, some items go unsold. There's end-of-the-line items that never get sold. So these are the items that we use in order for those people to furnish those houses. We have a showroom, which is a little bit like a model flat, and that way people can think about the flat, organize the way in which they will furnish it, and then if you look at the people and the way they design their flat, when they start choosing curtains and kitchen utensils, you can really see that they're really well engaged along the way.
Right, the knock-on effects of homelessness on people's health, on their ability to get jobs, their ability to form any type of stability, particularly with families. So we've got about 15 minutes left, and I just wanted to put that question to Matt, Chamoubil, and Frick as well, to kind of discuss what is it that people who've experienced homelessness, what is it that you think that policymakers perhaps don't understand, or they would like to have more of a voice when it comes to policy areas?
Me first?
Yes, absolutely.
I think there is 3 or 4 things. First of all, I think homeless people want policymakers and other people to know that homelessness is never a choice. I hear too often that argument. And of course, it's nicer for us and policymakers to see homeless. It makes the homeless you see, it makes it more bearable if you have the illusion that it might be their choice, but it's not their choice. And even if homeless people say that it is their choice, it's probably a question of pride, but it's really fundamentally a lack of services adapted to their needs, lack of housing, etc. So that's the first thing. It's not a choice. The other thing is homeless people are not guilty of their situation, or at least guilt is an irrelevant parameter in the whole discussion about how to solve homelessness. In UK, or at least part of the UK, it's enshrined in law, the difference between intentional and unintentional homeless. I think it's ridiculous. It's not because you are a drug user that you can be classified as having some guilt in your situation. These people are very vulnerable and they need help, and guilt is an irrelevant issue. The third thing I think they want policymakers and the general public to know is that they want housing, like anybody else. And that they can sustain housing, surprise, surprise. And my colleague referred to Housing First, which is one of these new approaches which moves homeless people with complex needs very quickly, if not immediately, into housing. And there have been very large scientific experiments, randomized control trials, and what it shows is that homeless people, even with very complex needs, they sustain the housing, or at least the large majority of them. So they can sustain housing and they want housing. And the last thing, I guess, the many things I think, because I think many homeless people are frustrated about what policymakers think about homelessness, but another important thing is that yes, it is probably costly to house homeless people. There is a budgetary investment necessary, but the alternative is costly as well, and often more costly. Shelters are expensive, and people don't usually stay constantly in shelter. They move from shelter into emergency hospital, into emergency psychiatric care, maybe come in contact with police, might end up in prison, etc. These are all very expensive services. In my city, or the city where I work, in Brussels, a night in an emergency shelter, which means night shelter only, night-only shelter, in 8 o'clock, out 8 o'clock in the morning, is about €70 per night. You can organize housing with support, all the support you want for that price. So the alternative that we have now is not necessarily cheaper. So yes, it requires a budgetary investment, especially to change from one system to the other. But in the long run, it's not more expensive on the public purse.
Shamabeel and Matt, I wanted to put the same question to you, and it's really it's kind of at the crux of what we're talking about, right? So this idea of people's experiences and the lack of ability to voice those experiences or have their voices heard. I guess that's, I mean, what you've both worked on. Both of your books and your writings have kind of touched on this quite vastly. I really wanted to get your sense of what it is that policymakers aren't hearing or aren't listening to when it comes to people who are affected by homelessness or the lack of access to affordable housing.
I'll give a really brief comment because I think Matthew has a lot more detail he can give us. But the way that I see it is the political balance is very much within the homeowners' court and not amongst the renters and the homeless. And we have, in New Zealand anyway, a culture that really distances itself from those who are seen as undeserving. So there is a deserving poor and an undeserving poor, as Freak just said. And essentially, when we look at poor people from a policy perspective, there is a sense that they should be punished or they should be given just enough to subsist, but not to actually have any space to recover and to get out of poverty. I think that's the mindset where we're starting from, whether we're looking at prison reform or whether it's housing reform. In there is a sense that those people don't deserve it and they must be punished. If they're going to get any support from us, it will come with conditionality. I think that's the underlying problem, and that bridge is very much about empathy. I think there is a distinct lack of empathy when it comes to politics across the whole political divide. We've been through an election, and I see no substantive change that's going to happen quickly.
I've spent the last several years meeting families who are homeless. And a few years ago, I was in a McDonald's with two young women, Crystal and Vanetta. And they had met at a homeless shelter. They were both homeless. Crystal had grown up in foster care in America and received her first eviction when she was 18 because she was spending over 70% of her disability check on the rent. Vanetta was working at a restaurant we have called Old Country Buffet, and her hours got cut, and she was so terrified of losing her home and maybe her children to the state that she committed an armed robbery to try to make the rent. And it didn't work out for her, and they both met at a homeless shelter. They were at McDonald's, and this kid walks in. He's like 9, and he looks really rough, and his clothes are disheveled and dirty, and he doesn't go up to the menu to order. He goes around to the table looking for scraps. He's hungry. So Crystal turns to Vanetta and she goes, "What you got?" And these two women who are homeless pull their change and they buy this boy lunch. And Crystal gives him this big hug and they send him on his way. And I think that what Crystal and Vanetta would tell you or me or any policymaker with an action like that is how gracefully people refuse to be reduced to their hardships. And I think it's a challenge for all of us that we should put ourselves in proximity with the poor. If we don't have someone's phone number on our cell phone who's homeless or currently homeless and we spend our days working on this, we might be going about it the wrong way. And we might not understand the problem with as much depth as we should because we're not close to the problem. You wouldn't let me get away with writing a book about Paris if I've never been to the city. You wouldn't let me get away with trying to cure cancer if I've never really studied the problem. But many of us write about these issues without being deeply embedded in the lives of the poor and the homeless, and that's a problem.
Great, thank you very much. We're coming towards the end of our session, so I would just like to bring the results of the poll up on the screen if possible, please. So this is the audience's take on the question which we posed at the beginning, which will come up in a minute, but the question was around the provision of good quality, affordable housing, and should it be seen as a human right? There were some comments as well on the question which I think are very valid, because I also asked myself that when I was putting the question down. Somebody asked, what is good quality housing? How is it defined? Who decides how it's defined? And what are we actually talking about when we talk about good quality, affordable housing? That's a really valid point, and something perhaps we could discuss as well. But hopefully we can get the results before the session started, it was mostly in favor of yes. So let's just assume that things haven't changed unless we get the result. Oh, it's still there, we are. 70-30. By referendum standards these days, that would be called a landslide. So a landslide in favor of yes. So should it be seen as considered as a human right? So the audience says yes. What do we really need to consider when we talk about policy? Because I mean, if we're kind of talking about policy when it comes to human rights-based approaches, it's quite different to general legislating. What can we do then to kind of ensure that governments really take this seriously and consider it as a human rights issue? Because, and this has actually come up as well in the comments that people were raising. People were raising that it should be seen as an issue of, in the similar vein to the provision of services, so the provision of clean water, the provision of health services, that housing should be seen in the same vein as that. What can we do then to ensure, to kind of encourage governments to see it more in this light? I'm leaving it open. Frick is raising his eyebrows at me.
I think for the 30% that said, I don't think it's a human right, I just want to tell them that I'm sorry for you, but it is a human right, because it is in human rights treaties that are accepted by all European governments. So if we want it or not, it's a human right. Whether it's a respected human right, that's another question, and maybe that's what people try to answer. So I don't think that the human right to housing is actually effective. I think one of the ways to make it slightly more effective is to get involved in human rights litigation. And I don't understand why there is so few social NGOs that get involved in litigation. Also at international level. My organization, Fianza, is one of the very few social NGOs, European social NGOs, that has submitted collective complaints against member states, against France, for instance, in 2008, and we won the collective complaint, which I don't want to claim any major impact, but it contributed to the adoption of the Loi d'Allo, which is the enforceable right to housing legislation in France, which has some problems, but it also delivered quite a bit of results. So I think litigation is really important. And the organizations that litigate, human rights organizations, tend to be not interested in housing. So the ones that are working on poverty and housing don't know how to do litigation, or afraid of litigation, maybe, and the ones that do litigation are not expert on housing. So I think there is some room for cooperation there. Maybe just one quick note, which is something that shocked me. We are funded by the European Union, by the European Commission. Very grateful, of course, for the funding, because if we don't get the funding, we would be dead. More than dead, even. But since this year, we're not allowed anymore to use the EU funding for litigation, human rights litigation. We can shout about human rights, we can talk about human rights, we can discuss about human rights, but we cannot litigate. It's pointless. Like, litigation is actually what makes human rights alive, and which can force governments step by step to adopt human rights approach. So it's a call on the European Union to reconsider and make litigation, human rights litigation, an eligible expense again.
Anybody else on the panel? Just, we're coming into our final couple of minutes to comment on this. Omar.
Yes, I think it's, I just also wanted to, because there's also a question signing my name, how is Vienna dealing with the Airbnb? We ended, and we're reforming now the building regulations, and we decided in this new building regulations that where the zoning is considered as a pure living zones, there it's not allowed to rent the places as a Airbnb. Either it's only your flat then, but we are really looking, because we have another study that about 2,000 flats in Vienna are now took out of the market, and they are really people who's doing it as a commercial purpose, having more than rented the flats and renting them back. But I think we have to deal also with the challenges in the life that's coming. So talking even about changing the culture and the living standard of people, we have to talk also about more density in building. I just was now 2 weeks ago in Baghdad, and there still the people dream that they have to have their own house. They live in a very small, pure 50 square meters, and they're not even ready to go in a flat or in a higher house where we would have 150 square meters. And these discussions we have in Austria also, we don't want to have higher buildings, we want to have the green rights. These resources are very, very pure. We have resources of money, we have resources of ground, we have resources of the social infrastructure that we have to implement in these places. That's why we really have to talk about the way how to deal it, and that's why we change also now the policy in Austria that we're not building in Vienna anymore the parking yards underworld, because if you don't need it, you can make flats on it. That's why we are building them more as a complexes, because once you don't need it, you can make something else for this space. So we have also to look about the challenges and about talking with the people and changing the culture of living style to match these things. And the last thing is also of our community flats that we have. Once they become empty, of course they're given to someone else, but a certain percentage are kept back for emergency reasons. People who will lose their flat because there was a fire, or because the dad died and they can't afford it anymore, or there was any damage, or there's a social problem. So the so-called Notfallwohnung, emergency flats, that is kept for this, and this is also one of the efforts that we use in Vienna to combat homelessness, that people who would lose their flat or a house unit in another place, they can get it in the city of Vienna, one of them.
Thank you very much. I want to say thank you to our 6 panelists. It's such a broad topic, which was really what struck me when we decided kind of what the scope of the panel was going to be. There's so much to discuss, because it's not just about the provision of affordable housing, it's about how we deal with the knock-on effects of that, whether people move into home ownership, if they can indeed move into home ownership, or if they can't and they become homeless or they become evicted. It's a massive topic, and we've just started, with the database, collecting housing details as well across OECD countries. So this is massively relevant within Europe at the moment also. So I'd like to thank the 6 panelists, thank the audience as well, and for your contributions. And there will be another session on here in 15 minutes, which is the future of work, how? Thank you.